The origin and history of the Khoisan people in South Africa. Khoisan. Khoisan or Khoesān is a catch-all term for the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa who traditionally speak non-Bantu languages combining the Khoisan heteros, formerly Hottentots, and the San people, also called Bushmen. Khoisan populations traditionally speak click languages and are considered to be the historical communities throughout Southern Africa, remaining predominant until European colonization in areas climatically unfavorable of Bantu sorghum-based agriculture, such as the Cape region through to Namibia, where Khoi populations of Nama and Damara people are prevalent groups, and Botswana. Considerable mingling with Bantu-speaking groups in evidenced by prevalence of click phonemes in many, especially closer Southern Africa Bantu languages. Many Khoisan people are the descendants of a very early dispersal of anatomically modern human to Southern Africa before 150,000 years ago. However, see below for recent work supporting a multi-regional hypothesis that suggests the Khoisan may be a source population for anatomically modern humans. Their languages show a vague typological similarity, largely confined to the prevalence of click consonants. They are not verifiably derived from a common pro-language, but are today split into at least 3 separate and unrelated language families, Khoi, Kwati, Tu, and A. It has been suggested that the Khoisan or Khoi peoples may represent late Stone Age arrival to Southern Africa, possibly displaced by Bantu expansion reaching the area roughly between 1,500 and 2,000 years ago. San are popularly thought as foragers in the Kalahari Desert and regions of Botswana, Namibia, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and northern Southern Africa. The word San is from a Khoi language and refers to foragers, those who pick things up from the ground, who do not own livestock. As such, it was used in the reference to all hunter-gatherer populations who came into contact with the Khoi-speaking communities and was largely referring to the lifestyle distinct from a pastoralist or agriculturalist one, and not to any particular ethnicity. While there are attendant cosmologies and languages associated with this way of life, the term is an economic designator rather than a cultural and ethnic one. Name. The compound term Khoisan or Khoesān is a modern anthropological convention in use since the early to mid-20th century. Khoisan is a coinage by Leonard Schutzl in the 1920s and popularized by Isaac Shapira. It entered wider usage from the 1960s based on the proposal of a Khoisan language family by Joseph Greenberg. During the colonial apartheid era, Afrikaans-speaking persons with the partial Khoisan ancestry were historically also grouped as Cape Blacks or Western Cape Blacks, to rather inaccurately distinguish them from the Bantu-speaking people, the other indigenous African population of South Africa, who also had significant Khoisan ancestry. The term Khoisan, also spelled Khoisan or Khoisan or Khoesān, has also been introduced in South Africa usage as the self-designation after the end of apartheid in the late 1990s. Since the 2010s, there has been a Khoisan activist movement demanding recognition and land rights from the government and white minority which owns large parts of the country's private land. Origin. It is suggested that the ancestry of a modern Khoisan expanded to southern Africa from East or Central Africa before 150,000 years ago, possibly as early as before 260,000 years ago, so that by the beginning of the MIS 5 mega drought 130,000 years ago, there were two ancestral population clusters in Africa, bearers of mtDNA haplogroup LO in southern Africa, ancestral to the Khoisan, and bearers of haplogroup L1 to 6 in Central Eastern Africa, ancestral to everyone else. This group gave rise to the San population of hunter-gatherers. A much later wave of migration, around or before the beginning of the Common Era, gave rise to the Khoi people who were pastoralists. This group carried DNA from Eurasian as well as some Neanderthal groups. Due to their early expansion and separation, the populations ancestral to the Khoisan have been estimated as having represented the largest human population during the majority of the anatomically modern human timeline from their early separation before 150 KYA until the recent peopling of Eurasian some 70 KYA. They were much more widespread than today, their modern distribution being due to their decimation in the course of the Bantu expansion. They were dispersed throughout much of southern and southeastern Africa. There was also a significant back migration of bearers of LO towards Eastern Africa between 120 and 75 KYA. Riddle et al. 2013 speculate that the pressure from such back migration may even have contributed to the dispersal of East African populations out of Africa at about 70 KYA. Recent work has suggested that the multi-regional hypothesis may be supported by current human population genetic data. A 2023 study published in the journal Nature suggested that current genetic data may be best understood as reflecting internal admixtures of multiple population sources across Africa, including ancestral populations of the Khoisan. Late Stone Age. The San populations ancestral to the Khoisan were spread throughout much of southern and eastern Africa throughout the Late Stone Age after about 75 KA. A further expansion date to about 20 KA has been proposed based on the distribution of the LOD haplogroup. Rosti et al. Suggest a connection of this recent expansion with the spread of click consonants to Eastern African languages, Hadza language. The Late Stone Age Sangoan industry occupied southern Africa in areas where unusual rainfall is less than a meter, 1,000 millimeters. The contemporary San and Khoi people resemble those represented by the anti-Sangoan skeletal remains. Against the traditional interpretation that finds a common origin for the KHOE and SAN, other evidence has suggested that the ancestors of the Khoi people are relatively recent pre-Bantu agricultural immigrants to southern Africa who abandoned agriculture as the climate dried and either joined the SAN as hunter-gatherers or retained pastoralism. With the hypothesized arrival of pastoralism and Bantoid agro-pastoralism in southern Africa dating around 2,300 years ago, linguistic development is later seen in the click consonants and loan words from the ancient Khoisan languages into the evolution of blended agro-pastoralists and hunter-gatherers community that would eventually evolve into a now extant amalgamated modern native linguistic communities found in South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, e.g. in South Africa, Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, Zulu people. Today, these groups represent the quantitative majority of extant admixed ancient Khoisan descendants by the millions. Historical period. The Khoi enter the historical record with their first contact with Portuguese explorers about 1,000 years after their displacement by the Bantu. Local population dropped after the Khoi were exposed to smallpox from Europeans. The Khoi waged more frequent attacks against Europeans when the Dutch East India companies enclosed traditional grazing land for farms. Khoi's social organization was profoundly damaged and, in the end, destroyed by colonial expansions and land seizure from the late 17th century onwards. As social structures broke down, some Khoi people settled on farms and became bondsmen or bond servants or farm workers. Many were incorporated into existing Khoi clans and family groups of the Xhosa people. George Smith, a Moravian brother from Erhard, Saxony, now Germany, founded Genadendal in 1738, which was the first mission station in southern Africa. Among the Khoi people in Bavaria in the Riviersonderend Mountains. Early European settlers sometimes intermarried with Khoi women, resulting in a sizable mixed-race population now known as the Griqua. The Griqua people too would migrate to what was by the time the frontier lands of the Khoisan native reserves and establish Griqua Land East, which contained a mostly Xhosa population. Andreas Stockenstone facilitates the creation of the Cut River Khoi settlement near the eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. The settlements thrived and expanded, and Cut River quickly became a large and successful region of the Cape that subsidized more or less autonomously. The people were prominently Afrikaans-speaking Gonakua Khoi, but the settlement also began to attract other Khoi, Xhosa, and mixed-race groups of the Cape. The so-called Bushman Wars were to a large extent the response of the San after their dispossession. At the start of the 18th century, the Khoi in the Western Cape lived in a state dominated by the Dutch. By the end of this century, the majority of the Khoisan operated as wage laborers, not that dissimilar to slaves. Geographically, the farther away the laborer was from Cape Town, the more difficult it became to transport agriculture produce to the markets. The issuing of grazing licenses north of the Berge River in what was then the Tilburg Basin propelled colonial expansion in the area. This system of land relocation led to the Khoisan losing their land and livestock, as well as dramatic change in their social, economic, and political development. After the defeat of the Xhosa Rebellion in 1853, the new Cape government endeavored to grant the Khoi political rights to avert future racial discontent. The government enacted the Cape Franchise in 1853, which decreed that all male citizens meeting a low property test, regardless of color, had the right to vote and to seek election in parliament. The property test was an indirect way by the British Cape government, who took over from the Dutch in 1812, to remain a racist-based system of governance because on average only white people owned properties adequate to meet the test. In the Herero and Namakwa genocide in German Southwest Africa, over 10,000 Nama are estimated to have been killed during 1904 to 1907. The San of the Kalahari were described in specimens in Bushman Coflo by William H.I. Blick and Lucy C. Lloyd. They were brought to the globalized world's attention in 1950s by the South African author Lawrence van der Post in a 6-part television documentary. The ancestral land conflict in Botswana concerns the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, established in 1961 for wildlife, while the San were permitted to continue their hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In the 1990s, the government of Botswana began a policy of relocating CKGR residents outside the reserve. In 2012, the government cut off all services to CGGR residents. A legal battle began, and in 2006, the High Court of Botswana ruled that the residents had been forcibly and unconstitutionally removed. The policy of relocation continued, however, and in 2012 the San people, Basarwa, appealed to the United Nations to force the government to recognize their land and resource right. Following end of apartheid in 1994, the term Khoisan has gradually come to be used as a self-designation by South African Khoi and representing the First Nations of South Africa vis-a-vis the ruling Bantu majority. A conference on Khoisan identities and cultural heritage was organized by the University of the Western Cape in 1997. And Khoisan activism had been reported in the South African media beginning in 2015. The South African government allowed Khoisan families up until 1998 to pursue land claims which existed prior to 1913. The South African Deputy Chief Land Claims Commissioner, Tami Ndotswa, he said that constitutional reform would be required to enable Khoisan people to pursue further claims to land from their direct ancestors were removed, has said that constitutional reforms would be required to enable Khoisan people to pursue further claims to the land from which their direct ancestors were removed prior to 9th June 1913. Discoveries. In 2019, scientists from University of the Free State discovered 8,000 years old carvings made by the Khoisan people. The carvings depicted the hippopotamus, horse, and antelope in the rain snake dike of the Fredford impact structure, which may have spiritual significance regarding the rain-making mythology of the Khoisan. Violence against the Khoisan. Herero and Namakwa genocide. The Herero and Namakwa genocide, about 10,000 Nama, a Khoi group, and an unknown number of San people were killed in an extermination campaign by the German colonial empire between 904 and 908. In Botswana, many of the indigenous San people have been forcibly relocated from their land to reservations. To make them relocate, they were denied access to water on their land and forced arrest if they hunted, which was their primary source of food. Their land lies in the middle of the world's richest diamond field. Officially, the government denies that there is any link to mining and claims the relocation of it preserved the wildlife and ecosystem, even though the San people have lived sustainably on the land for millennia. On the reservations, by struggle to find employment, and alcoholism is rampant. Physical characteristics and genetics. The Khoisan are one of the only populations with epicanthic folds outside the East Asia. They typically have a hair texture of the tightest possible curl and form of kinky hair, sometimes referred to as peppercorn, because of how it can roll into separate rounds on the scalp. Charles Darwin wrote about the Khoisan and sexual selection of the descent of man in 1882, commenting that their statopegia, seen primarily in females, evolved through sexual selection of human evolution, and that the posterior part of the body projects in a most wonderful manner. Historically, some females were observed by anthropologists to exhibit elongated labia minora, which sometimes projected as much as 10 cm below the vulva when standing. Though well documented, the motivations behind this practice and the voices of women who perform it are rarely explored in the research. In the 1990s, genomic studies of the world's peoples found that the Y chromosomes of San men share certain patterns of polymorphisms that are distinct from those of all other populations. Because of Y chromosomes in high conserved between generations, this type of DNA test is used to determine when different subgroups separate from one another and hence their last common ancestry. The authors of these studies suggest that the San may have been one of the first populations to differentiate from the most recent common parental ancestor of all extant humans. Various Y chromosome studies since confirmed that the Khoisan carry some of the most divergent oldest Y chromosomes haplogroup. These haplogroups are specific subgroups of haplogroups A and B, the two earliest branches of the human Y chromosomes tree. Similar to findings from Y chromosome studies, mitochondrial DNA studies also showing evidence that the Khoisan people carry high frequencies of the earliest haplogroup branches in the human mitochondrial DNA tree. The most divergent oldest mitochondrial haplogroup, LOD, has been identified at its highest frequencies in the Southern Africa KHOE and SAN groups. The distinctives of the Khoisan in both matrilineal and patrilineal groupings is a further indicator that they represent a population historically distinct from other Africans. Some genomic studies have further revealed that Khoisan groups have been influenced by 9 to 30% genetic admixture in the last few thousand years from the East African population who carried a Eurasian admixture component. Furthermore, they place an East African origin for the paternal haplogroup found in these Southern African populations, as well as the introduction of pastoralism in the region. The paper also noted that the Bantu expansion had a notable generic impact in a number of Khoisan groups. On the basis of PCA projections, the East African ancestry identified in the genomes of Khoi Kwadi speakers and other Southern Africans is related to an individual from the Tanzania. And that's it from Injibs Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.